So for those who aren't aware about Rony, before he started Magically, he started Mako Surgical. And that's when I met him first, back 10 years ago, 12 years ago actually. When we worked with, the Alliance worked with Stryker, not Stryker, at Mako. Stryker bought Mako, that's right. A nice quick penny, 1.6 bill, something like that. Yeah, not a bad day in the office. But, you know, we hear these stories, and we're going to get into this, and Rony and I were just talking about it. You hear these stories in reference to like, oh my God, you're so successful, you know, it's an overnight success. It's a grind. It's a grind. So let's get into this. How did you, first of all, at Mako, how did you develop Mako, and what is Mako?
Mako Surgical is basically a company I started in a grad school apartment at the University of Miami. So it's a $300 a month apartment. You're on scholarship, so it's kind of I think of it as like ramen venture, where you can just kind of scrape by and have a lot of time. And when you're in grad school, you can pick and choose classes, so you just have this like ambience. But I was doing biomedical engineering, which is a mix of med school and system engineering. And the short version is I got to see some surgeries. They look super medieval. And I'm thinking there has got to be a better way. And I grew up watching Star Wars. So the short form of Mako is like I just wanted to bring like those droids in. I'm like, it's got to be better. There's got to be a better way. And I didn't know anything. I'm a broke college student. I made $30 a week drawing cartoons for the Miami Hurricane. That was my income, plus scholarship money. And I figured I'm going to go start a tech company and build robots. And I got turned down about 300-400 times before a surgeon, I guess, felt bad enough for me to kind of like take me in with another engineer. And we were working out of his back office, I think making $500 a month, eating like 19-cent bean and cheese Taco Bell burritos. So that's the glorious beginning of Mako Surgical.
So one of the cool things on this is that on the last thing you see a guitar and bass player. And so one of the things is that I asked you before is how did that piece of your creative side, music, other piece, but on the technology world, how did you mate those together?
So I'll give you two examples, one more fun and then one more functional, which I actually think enabled Mako to really take off. But I remember one time early in Mako, if you're from Miami, you'll know there's a punk rock, I guess it's a bar and a venue called Churchill's, which is like the punk CBGBs of South Florida. It's like a super cool old, from the 70s, and like all kinds of famous people played there. So my band were playing there at 2 in the morning, and there's like drunk people throwing beer bottles at us. And then at 7 in the morning, I've got to go to Jackson Memorial to do a early surgery test with some surgeons on like early Mako prototypes. And I'm going, oh my God, what am I doing? Because like both parts of my brain are kind of like taking over at different points, the left side and the right side. But I think the more interesting thing is because I had the creative visual side, I was hanging out at SIGGRAPH, spending a lot of time with like video games and film, and we brought a ton of that tech into Mako. So the computer vision, the motion tracking, the 3D animation, that was from hanging out at SIGGRAPH, which is the ACM, the Association for Computing Machinery, where no one from MedTech was hanging out. It was like but then you heard about Pixar, and they had the Pixar computer that was for medical imaging. So there's a little bit of this crossover. So I was super interested in blending like animation and motion capture, and then Star Wars robots, which are influenced from like film and sci-fi, into MedTech. So the MedTech people thought I was just totally out there. And the other side didn't understand what I was doing in surgery. So it was this weird cross-blending of two disciplines. When you do like knee surgery today, without a robot, without any kind of computing, you basically make a fairly large incision, almost 6 to 12 inches, depending on what's going on. And they use like Home Depot carpentry type tools to align fairly big saws. And it's just like, routing something to in your home, like you're doing a bathroom expansion. It's like really just gung-ho, and my first surgery, I was sitting there watching this happen, like pieces of bone are flying in my face. I think it was like a total hip. And I got hit in my face with a femoral head, sprayed with blood. And the surgeon is just like, welcome to the OR, kid. And it was just insane. So what we wanted to do was to take 3D imaging of the bone and to be able to perfectly align using AI where the implant needed to be to maximize the life and endurance and functionality and fit. because it's this like complicated three-dimensional fit, and I'm watching what they're doing. They're just eyeballing this in this blood and guts environment. And I'm like, how the heck are you nailing this? And what they do is it's such a blunt, coarse procedure, it didn't really matter. So we went first after this like much more sophisticated like resurfacing. And there were like really two surgeons in the world, a guy named John Rapisi in Buffalo and a guy named Sergio Romagnoli in Italy, who could do this like artistic sculpting. And it was just not reproducible. And I said, if they can do that, but the results were amazing. Like you keep function, you could play tennis, people were still jogging, it preserved most of your tissue. And the really good ones, like those guys, could do it through a very tiny incision. So you go back one slide. Yeah, so this one, you could see, you could ultimately do it through, I think the best Mako surgeons are doing with like 2-3 inch incision, putting in kind of this resurfacing implant. And the bottom line was, it's like artistic sculpting, where we thought, okay, the visualization would help, and you call that computer navigation. But then even that wasn't enough to make it perfect. So the idea of the robot was to use force fields. Imagine that there's an invisible hand guiding your instrument so you can't make a mistake. So you could literally close your eyes, you could be 8 years old, you could never have done a knee surgery, and your outcomes are the same. And the idea is we wanted to democratize outcomes everywhere in the world so that the best day of the best surgeon, we were 10 times better than that, and that would be true everywhere. And that was the promise, and that's the promise of like, bringing computing and AI and robotics into medicine to sort of create this like very high quality, irrespective of like your skill set, which made the surgeons kind of upset. But I said, look, we're not removing you, at least not right now. So you're gonna work with this surgeon. You're gonna be like Tony Stark, you're gonna be Iron Man, you have this like superpower robot, makes you amazing. And you're going to do more surgeries. You could kind of do them with your eyes closed. And some of them actually literally were like, looking away while they're cutting. And the nice thing is, today in 2022, we've got like 15-year history on some of this, incredibly good outcomes. So the really cool part about Mako for me was a crazy idea. I started in grad school, and it's like dominating the market. Stryker bought us. It's sort of the premier way to do things in hip and knee. And the outcomes are amazing. So the patients have success. So it's kind of like one of those things where I think we rung every bell. And I think that's every founder's dream. And it's really cool to see an idea that I didn't really know would work. I just thought it would work. And all these people told me it wouldn't. And then fight it through 9/11, fight it through the stock market crash, and then ultimately see all these happy patients come out of it. So like that's probably the most rewarding thing for being a founder. It's not the capital.
So let's get into, he's already been hit up. So he's already been hit up today a couple times from other folks that are startups, and I'm like, hey, which is great, right? If you don't ask, the answer is always no. So speaking of that, so how did you mentioned about how many times you were told no. So how did you finally get to the point? Because, it's great when somebody comes up, oh my God, you're so successful, you're an overnight success. No, you're not. You're a grind for years on years. By the way, Stryker is the largest medical component or equipment company in the world. But talk about, how did you get the capital? How did you start to get there? And then how did you meet Dr. Foray? And let's talk about the talking stick.
Okay, so a couple things. I'll give you a couple quick stories about like just really interesting road to get this thing funded, and then the talking stick, which is a great thing Maurice and I did. But
good lesson.
Just two examples. One, first I had like friends and family and in-laws. So like once you have all your friends and family and in-laws in something, there's no way but up. There is no possibility for failure. The only thing you do is succeed, because it's going to be a disaster if it goes down for everybody. So in the early days, we were just literally ramen. I think it was Taco Bell burrito, bean and cheese burrito level of very little funding and just scraping by, and just a handful of people who were super committed. But then one day I get a call from Rodney Brooks, who ran the AI lab at MIT, and he and an investor were forming this thing called the Robotic Venture Fund, and they were funding iRobot, which makes the vacuum cleaner, Intuitive Surgical, which is the other dominant surgical robotic company, and they wanted to fund us. And I was like some miracle coming out of the sky. And they came down and they really liked what we were doing, and next thing you know, we got some initial funding, but it wasn't quite enough. And then, but we fought through, and about a year later, we had a really interesting investing group in downtown Manhattan, wanted to put about 10 or 15 million into the company. I was like super excited. I remember I get a call September 10th, 2001. My wife's so excited. We're just like bouncing. I call up. I think we had about 18, 19 people in the company at the time. I'm like, everyone gather early in the morning around 8. We're going to wait for the call because they have the partner meeting, and then call me right after and tell me that it's approved. So we're going to have this like party the rest of the day. So we're sitting in our little like makeshift conference room, and it's like we have the TV on because like we're waiting, we're just watching the news, and all of a sudden we see what happened in 9/11. And everyone thought it was the end. It was the end of the world. It was the end of the country. We didn't know what was happening, and we absolutely thought that was the end of everything. And it was just like the most awful, like we thought it was the best day ever, it turned into the most awful day ever. And then about 24 hours later, one of the investors that helped us in the beginning, he was our white knight. He basically said, look, no one takes salary. I'll keep the lights going. Get in a van, throw your prototype robot in a van. You're going to drive around the country and not come back until we're funded. So I talked to my wife. I got 2 of the guys in the van with our makeshift robot, and we literally drove everywhere, Midwest, East Coast, up and down for weeks. And everyone was turning us down. It's like, the world's ending. What are you doing? We're just driving around and around. Finally, this is like the craziest story. It's like one of the Made Mako stories. We end up being invited to Sycamore Ventures in Princeton. We drive to Princeton, New Jersey, drive all night. We've been sleeping in a Red Roof Inn, like 2 of us on the floor, flipping coins, who gets to bed. It was really nuts. Eating like Waffle House, we're just disheveled, smelly, hadn't showered. It was just really, really rough. And I completely bombed the presentation. I just totally ruined it. And we walk out dejected to the parking lot. And we're like, it's over. And the guy who invited us was a guy named John Whitman. And he basically said, you guys completely screwed this up, wasted our time. And we're walking out, and then he comes out after us. He sees us in the van. He's like, you guys look like you haven't slept for days. You haven't showered. I'm going to put you up in a good hotel, take a shower, clean up, come back tomorrow, do over. And we hit it out of the park. So God bless him. He passed away a couple years ago, and his partner was Christy Whitman. She was the governor of New Jersey. So after spending weeks in Red Roofs Inn, a short time later, I'm in the governor's mansion, and she's making me breakfast, squeezing orange juice, and I'm like, I don't know what just happened. And I got the do-over. So like but I told David, sometimes you just got to hang on to a piece of driftwood and just hope that sharks aren't going to eat you and you just survive. And just that hanging on, you don't know where it's going to come from, but like we had faith, and it was like we were at the very end. In fact, we thought we were past the end, but that do-over saved everything, and that guy really made a very big difference and that's why Mako exists, because I don't know what would have happened. So that was one of the pivotal stories.
So yeah, and here's the other thing too. This is my opinion only. People say, "Oh, everybody's an entrepreneur." I do not think so. It takes a massive amount of perseverance, grit, guts to go through that stuff. And just to your point, sometimes you're just hanging on to that piece of driftwood, hoping not to get eaten by the sharks,
yes,
as we sit here in South Florida. Anyways, but talk about how you got connected with Dr. Foray and the talking stick.
So I don't know if anyone knows Dr. Foray. So Maurice Foray, a friend of mine, and we built Mako together. So he's like an older brother. He's probably gonna hate me saying this, but a decade older. And when I was starting out the early beginnings of Mako, I got introduced to him, and he was already high flying, running a company out of Boston called VTI, doing computer surgery for ENT. And they were really having success. And he was like this big guy, and we're like this tiny little thing, kind of scraping around. And someone wanted to put us together, and Maurice was kind of entertaining it, but he was like so busy doing a bunch of stuff. And then GE bought his company, so it wasn't meant to be. But a couple years later, we met again. It turned out he would be a great fit to join. And it turns out like that yin-yang push-pull, the two of us, I thought was really important ultimately in building out a very complicated company that had robots, software, instruments, implants. We had to come up with a unique business model. We had to figure out training. We had to compete against all the big companies in our field who were thousands of times larger than us. So I think it was that mix of like his sales commercial mind, my sort of creative tech mind coming together. And the talking stick, which was an innovation from Maurice, was if you got into an argument, you just held this talking stick together. Like basically you're holding it, my hand, his hand, and you're just arguing it out, holding this talking stick until things are better. So you weren't passive aggressive. You just had to air it out. So if someone was grumpy, you'd grab the talking stick, you'd go into an office, you'd shout and scream, But because you're holding it together, it kind of forced a communication and it forced a resolution. And it was one of those cool things about how to make a company work that was really interesting. It wasn't just about tech, but it was about people and emotions and moving forward. So anyway, that was our talking stick.
That's a great lesson. I mean, so when I do these talks with folks, or I'm in an audience like y'all, and I hear somebody speaking that's a leader and it's accomplished, some great things, I try to always walk away with at least one thing, if not a couple, at least one thing. To me, when he first talked about or mentioned the talking stick, I'm like, all right, that's cool. How do I implement that at the Alliance? And do I really want to implement that at the Alliance? I mean, being across the person or other people, or even in, whatever, in Tech Hub, you have different opinion, or whatever that may be. So I think that's a great lesson. So, you get one from Congress, yeah, take it to the legislature. So things are rolling along at Mako, and did you have the vision all the time to be able to sell it? How did the Stryker piece come along, and were you guys pitching, they came to you? How does that come together?
So I'd say, and this is hopefully good guidance for anyone building a company, all these strategic partners and competitors were super interested in what we're doing, and they wanted to meet with us all the time. And in the beginning, we thought, oh my God, look at this company X wants to come in, and they'd send 20 executives like, oh my God, what's going on? And all they were doing was picking our brain. And they're wasting a lot of our time. So at some point realized we were just teaching them something we didn't need to, and they were just picking our brain. So when we started to ignore them, and we started to just double down and go, we're just gonna take your market away. When we got into that mode and we actually started taking market away, we decided, who are we gonna pick on? And we're like, we're gonna pick on Stryker. We actually decided to pick on the bully on the block. It was pick on J&J, Zimmer, Stryker. So we started to actually pick on Stryker accounts and win them. And I think that was really interesting. When we started to win accounts, real business, and take it away, and I think we were getting close to double-digit percentage of the market, and they were like, oh my God, if these guys keep going, they're gonna devastate us. And then we heard Stryker was copying us. We heard they had hundreds of people in Japan and other things trying to build our robot, trying to copy our regulatory strategy. And we were paranoid about it, and apparently it was failing, it wasn't working. We're we didn't know because they were so much bigger, had so much money, how could they not reproduce what we were doing? But it was only the act of being fully committed to winning in the market, making customers happy, patients happy, ignoring the competition actually, and ignoring the people who are just buzzing around and just do what we're doing and be great at it. Then they started to come around for real. And it was almost like this Zen thing. When you chase them, they're never gonna do anything. When you ignore them and win and do a great piece of work, that's when they got excited. And I think what happened, a very short story. So Kevin Lobo is a friend of mine, he's CEO of Stryker. He recently became the CEO, so a freshly minted CEO. His predecessor, I won't go into why he left the company, but there was some signal about Mako doing cool stuff. And I think one of Kevin's kids or something said, I heard about this robot, it's awesome. I want to be a bioengineer, you need to look into it. And then suddenly he's on a plane, he's flying in. And I think the first time he came in, it was no. He came back, I think the next day or two, and he made a much better offer. I was like, okay, welcome to Stryker.
Wow. At what point did you go, we're there, we're winning, or we're successful? Was it a point after the first sale or the second, or at what point did you go, okay, we're successful, I see my dream coming true?
So candidly, it was probably this year with Mako, when a surgeon friend of mine is at a conference and he's like, we have just given this keynote talk on 10-year data, 15-year data, and it looks amazing. And I finally could like take that breath.
Wow.
I go, I guess we were right. But I mean, until that point where we just had like just unbeatably solid data, you know, I'm always worried like what was going to happen, something else. But like it felt like, okay, I think we really got there. It was literally just like, you know, I think it was like September or something. A good surgeon friend of mine called up because I'm at a conference. Everyone's talking about Mako. The results are amazing. The 2-year to 5-year, the 10-year, we did it. I'm like, okay, I can take a breath.
Wow. All right, so let's transition from Mako into Magic Leap. All right, so you had the cell, and now you are focusing and to take time off. But here's one of the other things I want to share, is that, and I mentioned this to Rony when we were first talking about questions, and I'm like, how many people in the world actually can say that they changed the way humanity interacts with technology? I mean, it's pretty amazing. So you did it with Mako, you did it with Magic Leap, and that's pretty awesome. And then you Sarah, you're very humble about it. You're like, oh, my wife and kids don't, they're still like, take out the garbage, forget about all the other stuff. You're just still, Dad and Rony, right? But talk about that transition after Mako. You have the cell. What were you doing? Where were you when you came up with the idea of Magic Leap? And then how did you come up and go, okay, yeah, this is going to be my next endeavor?
Yeah, it's a great question, because I think the fortune of going public and then being acquired, didn't have to really do anything anymore, but I think I took a 1 hour break and I'm like, going to start another company. So I built out my garage. I literally started Magic Leap in my garage, and Mako was started in a dorm room. And in my garage, I'm thinking, where does computing go next? That was the question. And I was actually interacting with like a whole myriad of really interesting people simultaneously. So one of the most interesting groups was a group in New Zealand called Weta Workshop. And if you're going to come here in a few weeks, you'll probably watch Avatar. They designed Avatar, and they work with James Cameron. So it's Peter Jackson and Richard Taylor designed The Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, and they were working on Avatar when I reached out to them. And I said, I build robots, and I have this idea for something really crazy. Would you guys want to help me on it? And they basically said, a friend of robots is a friend of Weta. And I became good friends from, I think, 2009 onward with Richard Taylor, who is the co-founder with Peter Jackson. And it was really interesting because, like, it's a very weird move. They're on the other side of the world. I'm working with people on the other side of the world. So, like, we're on, like, video calls, and I'm going to bed, and they're waking up, and then they're working all night. I see stuff in the morning. But they were a great imaginative, creative partner. And for the longest time, they thought I was working on a movie, not a real technology. I said, well, we're going to make all this stuff. And they're like, yeah, we know how to make it into a movie. I'm like, whatever, we'll figure it out. But they really thought it was like a movie idea, which it kind of was, but it was also a technology idea. And the core of it was this thing called cinematic reality. I'm like, you guys make these amazing films. So much is packed into it. And especially when Avatar came out, I think 2009, it was like people had something called Avatar depression. They wanted to be in that world. And it was almost tasteable. But I'm like, the screen, sorry, IMAX, is really not the future. Like, sitting in a chair looking at the screen is not the future. I said, if we could paint the signal into your brain and you could actually immerse yourself in that world, wouldn't that be awesome? So I wanted to go to the best world builders on the planet. And Weta was one. Lucasfilm, which is owned by Disney, was the other. We actually worked with both. I'm like, how do you do that? How do you actually turn the brain into a movie screen? And that was kind of the starting idea of what this whole thing was. And I thought that was the future of computing, that we don't have a little screen in front of us. We could like paint into our brain directly. And that was the beginning of it.
So when Magic Leap got started, you guys, I think, after you got out of the garage, they were in Hollywood. And so we got the call, or the ability to go out and meet with Rony and his team, and the CFO, CEO were in first, and then Rony came in. And so, for those who are not aware what the Alliance does, we work with target industry companies, technology, marine, aviation, life sciences. And so this is kind of a bit life sciences, or actually the life sciences of Mako. But so we work with the state, the county, the city, whatever other organizations are to award job creation grants, dollars, this, that, capital investment, things like that. And the biggest ones are typically like $2.5 million, maybe $3 million, something to that extent, unless it's something else that's maybe 20. And that would be through a 20-year program. But nonetheless, it's so about it's a whole application process, and there's a lot of information that the company has to share because it's public does all that. So we go into the meeting, and I'm like, okay, what is Magic Leap? Okay. So now Rony comes in, and he's like, yeah, look, I don't want to do this in China. I want to do it here. And I'm like, okay, so how much money are we talking about? He's like, $500 million. And I was like, $500 million? What? Oh, all right, that's going to be. So then the kicker on it was, I'm like, so what is it? What are we talking about? Because I still don't know what the product is. He goes, well, I can't tell you. And I go, okay, let me just get this straight. You want me to go back to the state, the county, and the city and go, hey, this is really great technology, and $500 million is the request. And they go, what is it? And I go, I can't tell you. I don't even know because it's so top secret. But anyways, so we had that meeting. It was after you guys got the first, you proved the technology could work. You got the dot in the air. What did it feel like when you got the dot in the air? You're like, okay, now I know it can go from here.
Yeah, so what David's talking about, we had this theory of how you could access the visual cortex, which is about 40% of your brain has to do with like visualization. It's like the GPU, the graphics processor of the brain. We're like, how do we access that not through a screen, but light it up the way the real world does? And we built this thing called the light field signal generator. I called it the Beast. It took up a big part of a room. And we were in this little rinky-dink warehouse strip mall thing on Sterling Road in Hollywood. Like, you know, there was like accountant, like laundromat, and magically people thought we were like a travel agency. They had no idea what was going on in there. And you walk in, it's like unassuming office. You walk into this room, there's this crazy contraption that looks right out of the Matrix. And you sit down in it, and we were doing this. And the first thing we did, which I was super excited about, was you'd sit in the machine, you'd see a dot moving in space, floating around. So it was like the first pixel on a screen. It felt like the first time someone put a pixel on a computer screen, like in the 1950s, but there was not a screen. It was you. You were the screen, and you were moving it around, and you could just see it moving around in space. And I was super excited because I knew everything else was possible after that. It's like I just did a pilgrimage, and I did a pilgrimage before Mako, before Magic Leap, but I just did it again because I'm working on new startups, to Kitty Hawk. And if you go to Kitty Hawk and you see the Wright brothers' first 3 flights, one's like 150 feet, and you're like, okay, whatever. And then it's like 200 feet, and it's like 400 yards or something. And it's 2 guys in a woodshed, and like most people would not have been that impressed. And then like a year later, they're flying around Kitty Hawk, and then 10 years later, you've got like air transportation, and then 66 years later, we're on the moon. So that was our Kitty Hawk. That was like, if that's true, that was like our first Kitty Hawk flight, 100 feet, 10 feet in the air, rickety little thing. But if we made that work, I knew all the rest of it was possible because I could see everything that would happen after.
That's awesome. Okay, we talked about how you guys got the dollars for Mako and that grind. But this is a whole nother level. This is the request in the billions. And Chris Fleck, you had the Google glasses a few years ago, and when that first came out, and I asked you, what do you think? So you got to kind of see what, and you relayed to me, it's like, well, I'm not quite sure. This kind of works, but it's kind of funky. And for those not aware, Chris Fleck is with Citrix, and before that IBM and so forth, and just on the innovation side. So I was like, I don't know about Google Glass. What's that about? So my thought, and I say that only because when you are making the pitch for Magic Leap, and you're going after the billions, and Google gives you dollars. What was that like to have these conversations go, I want $1 billion? And they go, oh, okay, what? Or they go, yeah, sure. What was those conversations like with the investors? Because you raised over $3 billion, and which is a lot. And so what were those conversations like, and did you see the light go on with them when you had that, when they saw the technology?
Yeah, by the way, I'm probably going to write a whole book on Magic Leap because like from the day I started through like August 2020, which was like kind of the middle of the pandemic, it was like the most surreal ride I could possibly imagine. I don't quite even know how all of it happened, but I'll just give you one quick story. So we're going around, I'll tell you 2 quick stories about how this thing got started. So we were going around San Francisco and Menlo Park, Sand Hill Road, which is where all the venture groups are. And because of Mako, people were actually wanting to talk to me finally. So I could actually have meetings with the top blue chip venture firms. And as crazy an idea Magic Leap was, there were people who were giving us consideration, and people wanted to give us term sheets. So we had a term sheet. We were on our way to our closing dinner with the lead partner. I'm not going to name the firm. I'm friends with the guy because something really weird happened. So I get a call from a friend of mine, a guy named Fred Moll. Fred Moll founded Intuitive Surgical. They're the giant robot company in the soft tissue space, and Mako won in hard tissue. And Fred was an early believer and investor in Mako. He invested in Magic Leap. He's like the godfather of surgical robotics. Super cool guy. He calls me up. He says, I hear you're on your way to your closing dinner. Come by my office. I'm working on a new company. That new company J&J bought a couple of years ago for $5 billion. That was called Oris. So I show up there at the very beginning of this thing. And he's like, what are you up to? I'm like, I'm working on this crazy thing called Magic Leap. And he's like, hey, one of the Google founders is hanging around. He's going to come over and see what you're up to. So it was kind of like the Paul Allen of Google, a guy named Scott. So Scott was the guy who wrote all the code. Sergey came up with the math, and Larry had the vision. And Scott actually introduced Larry to Sergey. I never met Scott before, and he's sitting in Fred's conference room with flip-flops and like soccer shorts, you know, like shades up, just super cool and chill. And hey, if you have Google founding shares, you know, back in 2011, 2012, you're good, right? And he's just like, you know, we're about the same age, super chill. And he's like, he sees the venture guy next to me, and he's like, well, you don't need that guy. In front of the guy. And it was like he's like, come outside with me for a second. He's like, tell him to go away, come over to my house, we're just gonna talk about stuff, and then I'll give you a blank sheet of paper, and I'll be your fairy godmother. And that's what happened. It was totally insane. And then the venture guy just went nuts, and he's like, he starts editing the term sheet, and he's like, anything you want, and Scott's like, look, no, stop. I will win, there's nothing you could do, you have LPs, I'll beat you, it's over. And it was just like, I'm like, what's happening right now? It's just like, this isn't really happening. So that was like one of the most interesting moments, but I think even more crazy. I'll just tell you very quickly.
Good time.
So at some point, Scott he funded something called Willow Garage, which was open source robotics and AI. He put hundreds of millions into it to create an open source robotics and AI movement. Something called ROS, the robot operating system, came out of it. It's used all over the world. Super cool place. And they did this thing called the Beam Robot. It was on TV, like, you know, basically I think Sheldon from Big Bang Theory was driving around in it. That was Scott. I think he had Edward Snowden driving around and giving a keynote. So it was this like robot with a face that was like Skype or Zoom on wheels. So Scott put those, we were beta testers for it, in our office, the early office, I think where you came. So he could just pop in from the Bay Area into Florida and just drive around and like say hi. So it was normal to see a bunch of these Beam robots just zooming around our office and Scott popping in. So one day he pops in and there's another person in that robot with him, and that was Sergey. And they're like, hey, come out to Google. We want to see what you're up to. And I'm like, well, I can't move this giant contraption to you. And they're like, well, we'll send you a transport plane. We'll rent the C5 Galaxy. Like, we could do whatever we want. We have our own airfield. But I'm like, you know, why don't you guys come here? So it was just like month battle. Actually, it was like 3 or 4 month battle of like, you go there, no, you guys come here. Finally, they relented. And they all flew down. This was kind of crazy. Larry and Sergey flew down to our little tiny rinky-dinky office in Hollywood, Florida. And I kind of couldn't believe that, like, I was like arguing with them about flying out to Google and shipping all the stuff, but I thought it would break because it was so wired and duct taped together. If you just looked at it, it would stop working. And we got this magical thing that worked for, and like nobody knows what's happening yet, so like just let it be. So they came over, and I guess Larry and Sergey had a bet. And if you ever saw the movie Trading Places, I was the Eddie Murphy guy.
Yeah.
I'm completely serious, and I think so. Sergey lost the bet because he's the guy that developed Google Glass, and he's like, whatever they're doing doesn't work. Larry sat down, smiled, he goes, boom, and then Sergey sits down and goes, just grumpy face, and somehow they're like, get in the car. I'm like, I don't know what's happening. So I get in a black car with them, and they're Navy SEAL security guards, and we're driving around where I grew up in Hollywood, and they're like, well, what do you want? I'm like, we're your magical genies. So this is the second time that happened. Scott was that first one, and those two were the second, and they're like, I'm like, I don't know. Well, what do you need? I'm like, we need a lot to get this going. I mean, it's going to be hugely expensive to build this. It's like, you know, you probably need about $500 million done. And it was like super surreal. And I think that's where we started to show up on the map. And we just came out of nowhere because Google made a moon landing bet. So if you go back in time to like 2011, 2012, even like 13, 14, the idea of moonshots when Larry was running Google was a big thing. There was a lot more optimism in tech. Let's take big swings, amazing swings. And we weren't even the craziest thing they were betting on. They were talking about terraforming Mars, like all sorts of, we were like pretty modest relative to some of the other things they were talking to me about. So I felt like, okay, we're in good company. But that's a non-reproducible event. Anyone who's a founder trying to raise capital, I don't think that's just always going to happen. I can't quite explain why it did.
So one of the things, going back to that conversation that we had in Hollywood after we got the dot in the air, and I didn't have $500 million, and I didn't want him to go to China. I said, looking for places, I said, you know what? Look at the Motorola site plantation, please. All the bones are there, right? The bones are there. Talent is still around here. You obviously had to ship in a bunch more talent because you need a lot. But nonetheless, it just goes back to the history. We talk about the area, right? Simon, the first smartphone, IBM PC, and so much more that's been done here. It's really quite amazing. And then I love the part of putting Magic Leap in that because it was just historical building and so much came out of there and all the different patents and all the different work. It's amazing. But what was it like? I talked to one of the guys when he was doing the presentation when we went, and this was not the ribbon cutting, and that was still when you had the Beast, right, the giant one. But after you got going, I asked one of you guys when you were making pitches to NBA and NASCAR and all that. I said, what's it like? They come in here and they've never seen anything. They're not tech people really. They're the marketing people for whatever. And you guys like, yeah, we had somebody in here, whatever it was, NASCAR, some sports thing. And he goes, at first he was like, what is this all about? And then by the time he got done, he's like, oh my God, you're my new best friend. I love this thing. This is amazing. And so what was it like to see other people come in and then, wow, this is something I've never seen before? I mean, how did they maybe come in skeptical and then turn that whole thing around and be amazed by the technology?
Yeah, I think we had 99% of the people coming over skeptical, and we ultimately had thousands of people make a pilgrimage down to South Florida, which I thought was really cool to show that we really are able to do tech, and we have a tech campus. That was the Motorola campus, which I went to high school right there, so I used to drive by, and I was like, I can't believe we're in the building. There's a little Magic Leap Way sign now, which is really cool. Yeah. But they're very skeptical, and I felt like what we were doing wasn't about anything anyone had experienced for like maybe 80 or 90 years. It was like the first time someone saw television, the first time someone saw a movie in like the late 1800s. It was that kind of reaction. And that's how early all of this is. I think people don't understand how early in its life cycle, but it was like the first time someone saw a film, they thought the train was coming out of the screen. They were terrified, didn't know what it was. And the first time they heard voices coming out of a box with radio, or the first time you saw electricity, it was that a fundamental mental shift. But it was exciting, but also terrifying, because the exciting part was how cool it was to show someone something new, but then terrifying because how early we are in the commercial cycle. Because it took a long time for from that first Méliès movie until you had like Citizen Kane, until you had like Lucasfilm and Spielberg. I mean, there's like decades of societal shift and change required, but so we were really showing that moment of like the first time someone saw TV. That's what it was like.
So you mentioned the path, but what were some of the biggest challenges that you faced trying to get this? Because this is not just like, hey, I've got this robot now. When we were doing it for the first time, I explained, it's like, okay, you're not necessarily just looking out. The beams are coming into your eyes, basically. And then you had you had all sorts of different technology. You had people there that were not necessarily technologists, but how does the brain work? How does the eye work? How does all the hearing piece? What were some of the biggest challenges when you were trying to develop it?
So that's the Gen 2. I'll use that as an example. That's the one that just came out this year. It doesn't really show you on the outside here, but we had a system engineer. His name was Sam. His name is Sam. I recruited him away from Langley, NASA, and they called me up to what's Sam was one of our star engineers coming down to Florida to work on this Magic Leap thing because he lost his mind. But the reason I'm citing Sam is that we felt like we were doing Mercury, Gemini, Apollo. We'll talk more about that later, but the amount of systems in that ML2, Sam said, was roughly equal to what you had in the Saturn V. Just super compressed and tiny. We didn't have explosive fuel, but if you unpack what's going on in there at a nano and micro scale, it's insane. It's probably 20x more than what's in an iPhone, including the computing, the battery, the thermal management, the sensors. Just there's so much stuff that had to be compressed. So it's not big, but this was actually much harder than Mako because we had to compress so much technology into something that looked like nothing and was incredibly tiny. And a fragment of what that did used to be the size of an office when we started out. And just massive compression of technologies, making it smaller and smaller, and countering the challenges of like thermal and physics and how far can you push like not just silicon, not just Moore's law, but all these other things, and in trying to invent like new optics that could do things that no one had done before. It was an incredible engineering challenge. So I think one of the hardest things was the organizational build of all these different disciplines all working together on one project, which requires like this massive mission orientation. It's not a SaaS company. We have to build everything: optics, electronics, sensing, computing, AI, chip design, application design, UI design, media, all of it at the same time in the same building, mostly in the same building, with people from disparate areas. And it's not like we had a legacy. We're not Microsoft or Apple with 30 years of computing experience. Everything was built from scratch. So that was an incredible engineering challenge. And the only thing I could reflect on was, and we took the team on some trips to Cape Canaveral and to Cocoa Beach, like, hey, they did it. and we go look at the Saturn V and like, that's harder than what we did. And then Sam's like, well, we've got the same system complexity. I'm like, shh. But that was one of the real challenges. Like, how do you get so much done with so many disciplines in such a tiny package?
Wow. So one more thing on the Magic Leap. Where is it in its growth cycle and your full vision of it? You mentioned about the space piece, but if it's what did we talk about? Gemini, Apollo, so forth. Where is Magic Leap in that full growth of your vision?
Yeah, so I thought of the Gen 1 as like part of our Mercury phase. And if you're familiar with like Mercury, Gemini, Apollo, Mercury was like Alan Shepard being shot up in a little tin can, just orbiting for a little bit, coming back to Earth. And if you just looked at that, you're like, you're never going to the moon. This is very disappointing. Like a casual observer looking at NASA would have thought we failed, because what did Mercury do? But Mercury was super important because it proved you could do Gemini. So to me, when we were designing this, and we started this like 5-6 years before the pandemic. And it was actually coming out of manufacturing in early 2020, and then the pandemic hit, you got all this other stuff. But this just came out, and I thought this was like our first mission in Gemini, not the whole Gemini phase. And Gemini was actually a really weird part of NASA, because we weren't landing the moon. We were just going into space and like doing spacewalks, and people were getting very like, are we ever going to go to the moon? What's all this nonsense you're doing? So I think casual observers and the press have no idea how hard it is to actually land something on the moon, especially something super complex, and it takes all these stages. So we had this Gen 1 whole thing from the Beast through the ML1, and then the ML2 and a whole bunch of things that will follow after that I won't talk about, I thought of as our Gemini phase. And Apollo was kind of like, I wouldn't say it's the full fulfillment, but Apollo was like later this decade. And then living on Mars, I thought was 2030s. So my vision was, we're going to get to that living on Mars moment. It's going to be absolutely incredible. But you have to have the patience and the endurance and the stick-to-itiveness to follow through. And I think what's difficult in the commercial markets is that story doesn't stick. The only thing that sticks is like a one-sentence thing on Twitter. And the press, which is weird, like when I started Magic Leap was optimistic. You had people like Kevin Kelly, Stephen Levy, these optimistic tech writers. And then in the middle part of Magic Leap, press got really negative on everything. And I think press is still quite negative about anything you're trying to do in tech. So there isn't that positive boost you always had when companies like Apple got built and companies like Microsoft. There was a lot more support, and hopefully it comes around again. Hopefully there is this enthusiasm and optimism that I think like Disney had when he came to Florida. Like, you could do anything here. We can go to the moon. We could do all sorts of incredible things. We could build Epcot. That was the enthusiasm we were trying to inject here, and I always knew it was a long journey. It was a journey in parts. So you had the Mercury, you had the Gemini, and you have Apollo, and then beyond Apollo you have Mars, and then beyond that you have like Explore the Galaxy. And that's what got all these super smart people to move from all over the world and come to Florida, because they did that to go to the moon, and they did that to try to like explore what we called inner space.
Very cool. Awesome. So now you're on to your next venture. You moved on from Magic Leap. Talk about Sun and Thunder, and then the AI piece and SynthB, and then I've got one last question for you after that.
Sure, cool. So I'm going to talk a little bit because I'm not really talking too much about them. But I started two new companies. One is like a Studio Ghibli baby Pixar I call Sun and Thunder. And we're about to put out an animated short I developed with Weta, the same people that worked on Avatar. That'll come out next year. That's part of a longer, hopefully animated feature film called Our Blue, but you get to see a little bit of that early next year, hopefully. It was also an incubator for creative and tech ideas, and out of Sun and Thunder, I spun out something called SynthBee Inc., which I won't talk much about other than the name, but we are going pretty deep into, I would say, contrarian use cases of AI. I'll say this, I think AI is the most powerful force in the economy and technology in anything for the next probably 50 to 100 years. And I saw what it could do to society. We built a lot of AI at Mako and a lot of AI at Magic Leap, and my friends were running the biggest AI companies in the world, and I didn't like the direction it's going. And I wanted to have a direction which is much more compatible with humanity. And I think AI is going to force a lot of complex social issues later this decade into the 2030s. You're seeing them right now with like AI language generators and AI art, and some of that's unstoppable. The question is, how do you blend people and AI together to do great things to solve humanity's problems? Or does it wipe out jobs and become this like huge problem? And I think some of the big companies I won't name right now may not care so much about what happens to society. We've seen their lack of caring with other things they've done. And I wanted to build a counter to that and do that again here in Florida. So that's the other company.
Awesome. So, right before we jump into questions from the audience, what do you think, just in general, and in reference to what's going on in tech here in South Florida as well as around? So you mentioned, big tech. So the metaverse and just the absolute fall of crypto. Are we in a crypto metaverse, winter? You mentioned about the dollars that metaverse has lost, which I didn't realize it was that much. But what are your thoughts on where we are now with that?
Yeah. So quick background. Probably all know that like Miami threw out a big flag, like we're the crypto capital of the world, and crypto has just completely collapsed. It looks like disaster. And then Facebook, which was one of my competitors in building Magic Leap, renamed itself Meta. And what's interesting about that is the name Metaverse came from a guy named Neil Stephenson. He's an amazing science fiction writer. He wrote Snow Crash and a bunch of classic science fiction novels, probably one of the great living sci-fi authors today. He was my chief futurist at Magic Leap. He coined Metaverse. Facebook renamed itself after one of Neil's ideas, but he wasn't working for them. Never gave them the rights to use Meta anyway. But that's a different story. He's doing Lamina One. I'm an advisor of Lamina One. So I think what's happening with Metaverse is this. There is a lot of analyst talk about this thing being worth tens of trillions in the 2030s, which sounds insane when you realize, though, it is the growth of the internet, which is already a multi-trillion-dollar thing. It's really the scaling of the internet with new technologies growing on top of it. So then you can wrap your mind around this really is very big and is not going away. So I think on the metaverse thing, Meta itself has lost over $700 billion in the last 12 months. But not because they're chasing metaverse, but because their business model is being squished by Apple and others. And they have to, at all costs, move on to another platform that they want to control. That's really what's going on. But they've lost tons of value there, and their early attempts at trying to do the whole metaverse themselves, it's like trying to do the whole internet yourself, they're not working that great. But I think I'm very bullish on the mid to long term idea of the metaverse. It's the internet evolving, and I think that's still going to hold. And on crypto, which is sort of an offshoot, it's like the kind of blockchain and distributed computing. I think there's a lot of nonsense scam stuff that we're trying to fleece not very intelligent investors early on, and some very intelligent investors who just got really greedy. This also happened in 99, 2000, 2001 with the internet crash. And out of that crash came the biggest, most important companies in e-commerce, in search, in computing. So I think the winter really is the best time to start a company if you have real tech, smart people, endurance, and a really good business model. If you're just trying to like score a hit, like get some investor who doesn't know what they're doing to give you money to quick flip something, I think that's a huge problem. That's a loss. And hopefully South Florida doesn't get lost in this crypto winter, but hopefully we have companies and people that have the endurance to see the mid and long term later this decade in the 2030s and have the resilience to build real things and not get caught up in hype, because Google wasn't hype. They didn't crash because they actually built real stuff. It was like an amazing AI search engine. It was brilliant by three genius guys who kind of came up with it. those are the things that survive. All the kind of like superficial nonsense internet things, they died. So I think if you're building something real here in South Florida, you have a very good shot, and whether it's crypto or blockchain or decentralized computing or metaverse related technologies, it's huge opportunity. So I think like don't look at the winter as I should quit, look at it as this is the time to double down, but make sure you're building really good stuff with a great team and real IP.
I want to go ahead and thank our sponsor for the opening session. Brightline Trains, so if you, maybe some of you came today on Brightline, I know one of our folks in our office takes Brightline down from Palm Beach every day. So thank you, Brightline, for the opening session keynote with Rony. Thank you very much.
So my question for you is, I was recently mind blown by the generative AI stuff. Obviously, you've been thinking about this for a while. What do you think the biggest change in user interface is going to be once we can actually, we don't have to go in Excel and do everything, we don't have to Photoshop things. What do you think user interface is going to look like in the next 10 years using AI?
Really good question. So a friend of mine is the founder of Midjourney, which you probably know. I think the answer to your question is part of one of my new startups, so I'm going to be careful. I think it's going to be completely different, and I think people are going to feel like they have just like amazing superpowers, which were being given through like what computing is starting to do with sensors, generative AI, the ability to visualize and hear and see things. We will start to look and feel like we come out of a Harry Potter world. I think that's what's kind of happening. You know, you speak and something happens, and it's just boom. I think there's some danger there and there's some excitement there, because it's a power that's so nonlinear and so amazing that just like Harry Potter, you're going to have like Slytherin, and you're going to have like, you know, the good ones and the bad ones and the Jedis and the Sith. So I feel like it's exciting and terrifying simultaneously, but I think mid-2030s, it would be really weird to think that anything you're doing in computing resembles what's going on today. I think it's going to completely change.
This week I started playing around with ChatGPT and looking for, you know, opinions or thoughts you've got about that, OpenAI, and just some of the, you know, the gaps between now and that future state.
If you're not familiar with ChatGPT, it's available through OpenAI. You can Google it. It is terrifying if you're a writer or almost anything, because you just ask it to do something and it's writing essays and thinking. And if you just are skeptical about AI, this will end it. You know, if you just spend a day on Midjourney and a day on that, you're going to wonder what you should do. So a couple quick thoughts. One, huge believer in blue-collar tech workers. It's going to sound odd, but I personally think in the 2030s, white-collar jobs are probably gone. And if you don't believe me, get on Midjourney, play with GPT now, and if you sit behind a desk in front of a computer, your job may not be there in the 2030s. But if you work with your hands, you work in the field, if you're a chef, if you're doing real things in the physical world, and you can amplify that with technology, I think that's what the future looks like for people. I don't think we're going to be replaced by physical robots anytime soon. People are trying that, but our brain is actually getting replaced much more quickly than our body. So the janitor is a lot better off than the analyst on Wall Street. It sounds weird, but I think it's incredibly powerful. The speed at which everything is going is amazing, and I think Elon Musk, who's controversial on many levels, said something really interesting though. The total compute power of human brains against total compute power available synthetically is changing so fast. Look at that ratio. And my prediction is by 27, 28, like it's all past us. And then you're in the 2030s, like $1,000 chip is like, 8 million people. So think about what that means. Look at the buildings that are warehousing someone sitting in front of a computer and realize that's replaceable with a $1,000 chip in the 2030s. And what does that mean about your business, about how you think about the world? What does that mean about people's jobs and their meaning in life? I think we're coming through an existential, social, cultural, maybe it's universal basic income, but our capitalistic pressures are going to go down that path because it does increase shareholder value. We have this huge tension between capitalism and the social unrest this will cause. So I'm trying to play in that and go, how do you build a company that balances those things?
We all, many of us understand what's behind placebo effect. What is self-healing? And my question is whether we can create a platform for humans to help themselves with their positive belief system, with your technology, to reduce stress, reduce insomnia, anxiety, pain, which really drain our vitality and is the open gate for illnesses.
Oh, that's a conference, not a question. So I'll try to give you a very brief beginning of an answer, but at the start of Magic Leap, we worked closely with a brilliant Hungarian scientist named Franz Joles, who ran Harvard's imaging lab, and unfortunately he passed away about 7-8 years ago. Brilliant genius guy, was on our clinical and scientific advisory board. And I think if he was here, and I'll try to channel what he was talking to us about, some of it got lost, but he was just a super brilliant guy. He was on NIH bioimaging. He believed, and then got me to believe, that the brain was a completely reprogrammable system, and that all of our diseases and all of our anxieties could be reprogrammed. And I think you're starting to see some of that in the people doing brain-computing interface. But some of that's invasive, right? He thought we could non-invasively, using the retina as a doorway and as a keypad, access the parts of the brain that know how to heal the body, know how to deal with depression and anxiety and OCD, and even things like cancers, because it's like the CPU of the whole body. That if you can actually talk to the brain and figure out its programming language, and we thought that the retina was the keyboard, and there was a programming language that you could access for the brain. And he actually called me up, and this is why I stopped researching this, but it's a great, interesting thing you bring up. He called me up and said, I've solved it, and the next day he was gone.
Wow.
So I kind of said, maybe that part of the game I'm not going to play right now, but it stuck in the back of my mind because he believed these things. He said he solved it. I really don't know if he ever wrote it down in a notebook, but I think what you're seeing now with brain-computer interface companies is the exploration that the brain really does have this command and control over so many parts of the body. And I think, I can't tell you if it's this decade or next or the one after, but there will be neuroscientists working with things like this and other BCI that will unravel the brain's programming language. And you will be able to use software and relieve anxiety, relieve OCD, relieve depression, maybe even treat cancers. I think that's going to be an incredible thing. Deal with Parkinson's, because you have these misfiring neurons, and it's like you've got software and hardware malfiring, and the brain could repair itself. So I think it's a great question, but this is a whole conference, actually. You should start a conference on it.
So super interesting. Thank you for coming. The one question that I had was, it feels, what you just said now about using the retina and the eyes as the programming language, it feels like an incomplete language to me, where I am not super familiar with this space, but Elon Musk, for example, they're doing Neuralink, which feels like they're exploring the idea of using a more complete programming language, right? So you feel like, is this just gonna be leapfrogged? Are you intending to be deprecated yourself, right? How do you think about a more direct brain interface that's probably gonna be more invasive, but how do those things kind of interrelate, and where the future will take us on that?
Short answer is I'm an advisor to 3 competitors to Neuralink. One that makes a tiny robot that flies around the brain like I think it was the Incredible Journey movie. One that's actually a company in Boston that was founded by a Neuralink founder who didn't like what was going on at Neuralink, called Precision Neuro. So they're doing some really interesting, I think, very practical work in what you're saying. So I do believe in that approach. I think it's a combination of the 2 approaches. And then there's another company that I'm beginning to help out, which is using a tiny implant in the skull that could basically transmit electromagnetic frequencies into targeted parts of the brain to do focal treatment for depression and other things like that. So and again, I think it's very coarse. We're in the 1940s. We're at the early level of understanding computing in the brain, but I think this is going to be one of the biggest areas of neuroscience and computing for the rest of the century. So super cool area.
All right, well, Rony's got to get going, and we want to just thank you for taking the time thank you for not leaving South Florida after all your success. So help me say thank you.